Hey there, today we're going to continue exploring Railway. We're going to learn how to deploy a cron job. We're going to look at private networking, and we're going to learn about volumes. We're also going to look at some of the shortcomings of the platform and some of the limitations that exist. So lots to cover. Let's go. All right, before we start with the code, let's take a quick look at what we're actually building. So we're going to have a cron job, and that cron job is going to run every 15 minutes. It's going to call out to a public API. It's going to grab some data, and then it's going to call into our REST API, which is going to be another service. And this REST API is going to have a volume attached to it. So the cron job every 15 minutes calls into the REST API, and the REST API writes some data to the volume. We're going to look at the code in a little bit, but first, let's look at some definitions. All right, so what is a cron job? Cron job is essentially a way to run a task on schedule. You can run every 15 minutes, every hour on the hour, or at 3 a.m. every other Sunday. There's a specific syntax that you use to define this. And a good website to figure out what you want is actually cron tab. As you can see here, this is the website, and you can type in the expression that you want to see. So in our case, we want to run every 15th minute. This is what the expression would look like. But you can also say every 15th minute past the hour, or every 15th minute past every 5th hour, right? So you can play around with this. You can kind of find what schedule you want to run on, and you can set any task on Railway to run on this schedule. So that's what we're going to do for our cron job. So back in here, we can say that if we want our cron job to run every 15 minutes, the schedule is going to look like this, right? Whoops. Where's that asterisk? Something like that. Now, some cron expressions require, like, for example, this will be seconds instead of minutes. I know for a fact that I think Azure Microsoft Azure has a way to specify seconds. But one of the first shortcomings, or I should say limitations, of Railway is that they allow you to run a cron job once every 15 minutes. It's in their documentation that that is the minimum allowed time that you can run at. So 15 minutes for the cron job. So this is what a cron job is. It's essentially a scheduled task, and it uses a specific syntax to tell it what the schedule is going to be. All right, let's talk about the REST API. No, I'm just kidding. We're not going to talk about REST API. I think y'all know what a REST API is. So let's talk about a volume. I'm not talking about sound volume. I'm talking about storage volume. Storage volume is essentially a way for you to persist data. You create a volume, and then you mount it inside your service. So for example, let's say you have a Postgres database. You're not using Neon, and you're self-hosting a Postgres database in Railway. Well, you need somewhere to write that data, and that's where storage volume comes in. So you create it, and you mount it inside your service, and now you have persistent storage available inside your service. So that's what a volume is. In our scenario, we're going to use a volume to persist a file that's going to have text in it. So it's not going to be very complicated, but we're going to have a REST API that's going to receive a post request, and it's going to write data from that post request to the mounted volume. So that's the architecture of our application. Now let's take a look at our code. All right, here's our solution. So 2 projects, CatFacts API and CatFacts cron job. These are stupid simple. Let's look at the cron job first. We have the catfact class, which is just a simple class that's going to store some data for us. The fact itself and the length of the fact. And then we have program.cs. And really all this does is for demonstration purposes, obviously, is it creates, instantiates a new HTTP client, goes and fetches a catfact from the catfact.ninja URL, does some error checking, creates a URL. We'll talk about this a little bit later. This is for private networking. And once it has the URL built, it goes and posts this fact that we just retrieved to the API. This is the URL of the API right here. That's it. That's what the cron job does. Now, the API is a little bit more interesting in that it only has a little bit more code in it, but a lot of it is error handling. So just in my previous video about Railway, we're spinning up an API application. Now, this one is not AOT, just a regular application, a web API application. Now, one thing that is key is this part right here, because the way that Railway does internal private networking is through IPv6. So you need these like 2 asterisks inside square brackets for this to work. We also have some health checks, as with the other video. We also grab an environment variable here, the catfact path, and we also grab the port. We're gonna set these variables later in Railway. We do some error handling. We then define the health check path, and then we have 2 endpoints. We have our get endpoint. This is that endpoint that we can hit to get a list of all the facts that are currently stored on the volume. And then we have the post, and this is what the cron job is going to be calling. So in here, it's expecting a catfact object. We do some error checking here. If the file already exists, we open it up, and then we check if the fact already exists, right? Because we don't want to write duplicate cat facts to the same file. We just want to have unique facts in our file. And if all is well, we move over here, and then we append the new fact to our log file and return A204. So that's the API. So it's a little bit more complicated with 2 endpoints. We also have the catfact class here. Now, obviously, this is duplicating code. We have a catfact here and a catfact here. If this was like a real application, I would obviously have a DLL that would share this class out. But, you know, like, work with me here. This is just a demo app. And then both of these also have a Docker file. This is a default Docker file. You can see I even left the comments in here. Nothing has changed. This Docker file and this Docker file, these are a little slightly different. That's because we are exposing a port on the API, whereas we're not exposing a port on a cron job because it doesn't have any endpoints, right? But other than that, that's it. No extra packages or anything like that, just the API and a console app. I have pushed this project to GitHub, and it's ready. It's one solution in one repository, both projects. So we're going to be able to access it from Railway. So let's jump into Railway and see how we go about setting this all up. All right, here we are in Railway. First thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new project. Now I have dog facts here, but we're going to create cat facts. Now, which one do you like more, dogs or cats? Post it in the comments. So let's click on new project. And we're actually gonna not choose any of these top options. We're gonna say empty project. So this creates a project that has nothing in it. We're gonna fill it out over time. Now you can see they created it with a default name, Affectionate Luck. Now that's actually not a bad name, but let's rename it to something more coherent by going to settings up here and then saying cat facts, like that. And we can say, these are cat facts, like that. Click on update, and we're golden. You don't need to deploy these changes because, well, there's nothing to deploy because we don't have any services yet, right? While we're in here, we're gonna add a shared variable. Now you may be asking, what's a shared variable? Well, it's essentially an environment variable which is available to all services in the project. Not by default, but you can add it to the service without needing to define it individually in each single service. So it's quite handy. So let's click on shared variables. And you can see here that it's listing the environments. So you may have a shared variable for production or for development, and they may be different. So we only have one environment, so we're going to select production. And then we're going to type in cat API domain, like that. And we're going to say, what should we call our cat API? Maybe cat facts API, and click add. All right, that'll suffice for the variables. I think that we can move on to creating our cron job, our web API, and our volume. All right, we can go up to architecture, and you can see here that we have nothing here. And it's like, yo, adding new service. So we can click on this square or the rectangle right here, or we can click on create up here. I'm just gonna click here because I like rectangles. So it's asking me, what do I need? Well, I don't need a GitHub repo, not yet. What I'm actually gonna do is I'm gonna create an empty service. Zucchini elegance, not quite what I'm aiming for, but let's click on that. Let's go to settings. Now we're gonna rename this, although I do love zucchinis. We're gonna call this cat facts cron job as such. Press enter to submit, and we have now renamed our cron job. Next, we actually want to set the timer at which this cron job is going to run. So we discussed earlier that we want to have it run every 15 minutes. So stay inside the settings tab, scroll all the way down until you get to cron schedule. And in here, we're going to type in a cron expression. So what's really cool about this UI is that as you start typing, let's say 0 star 15 star star star, it says at 0 minutes past the hour every 15 hours, right? So that's not really what we're looking for. Perhaps we're looking for something like this, which is every 15 minutes. So if we're satisfied with this, which we are, we're going to click the check mark to save. We don't need a health check because this is a cron job, so it's going to build, run, and then tear down. Literally deploy and destroy every 15 minutes. We don't need a restart policy, but one more thing that we do need is a variable. So let's click on variables, and we can add the shared variable, which we added earlier. So if you click on the shared variables here, you can see that cat API domain is available for us to add. We can just click this add button on the right side here, and we're good. And we're also actually going to need one more variable that's specific to the cron job. So let's click on new variable. And then in here, we're actually going to use a railway variable. So you can know it's a railway variable when it starts with the word railway. And we're actually going to say Docker file path like this. And what we're looking for to put in here is the path to the Docker file from the root of our solution. So if we take a look here back at Visual Studio, you can see that this is the root of the solution, then cat facts cron job, and then Docker file. So in here, let's type in cat facts cron job / Docker file. And that should be it for the cron job. So schedule runs every 15 minutes. It has the variables that we need, and all the settings are good to go. So let's move on to creating the service and the volume. So next thing we're going to need is a service. Now we don't have a cool rectangle anymore, so we have to click this create button. So let's go ahead and do that. Now it's asking me what I need again. I'm going to create an empty service. Great. We're going to go ahead and rename this right away. We're going to call this cat facts API. Now, this is the same as the shared variable that we created. Cat facts API. Now, this is an API service. So what we actually want to do, we're going to connect the repo a little bit later, and we cannot do networking yet, and we can't set anything custom here in the build area. But what we can do is we can add a variable, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to need another one of these variables, Railway variables, and it's kind of the same dance as the cron job. So Docker file path, and then if I remember correctly, this is cat facts API, cat facts API, Docker file. Click add, and we're good here. Now back in settings, we do actually want to set a couple things. So not cron schedule this time. We want a health check path, right? If you recall in our code, we set it to /health. So let's type that in here and click the check mark. And we also want a restart policy. Now, personally, I like always, just in case. And I think that's all that we need in here for now. We'll come back here later for networking. So let's click on deploy to save all the changes. Now you can see it was really quick, and that's because we haven't hooked this up to GitHub yet. Now before we do that, we're going to create a volume. And to do that, we go back to our architecture diagram, and we click on create. Now we do want to select volume this time, and it's asking us where we want to hook it up. So we want to hook it up to API, and we want to call it facts. Actually, we don't want to call it facts. It's called tow volume, but the mount path is facts. Now this is going to be relevant because this is where our code is pointing to inside of our API. So let's rename this tow volume to facts volume. That makes a little bit more sense. And let's click on deploy to save the changes. Now, one last thing that we got to do, and this is again a quirk of Railway, is our service is not going to be able to access this volume. Yeah, it's weird. And that's because we're not a root user. The service is not a root user. So there's a workaround, and that workaround is, you guessed it, an environment variable. So we'll come in here and we'll put something in here again. It's a Railway provided variable, and that's Railway run UID, which means this service is gonna run as user with the ID of 0. So toss that in here, click deploy. I think everything is now in place. We can start adding our GitHub repositories. So under settings, let's do the API first. Let's click on connect repo. And you can see here that I have a repository on GitHub that I've already connected. And you may remember this one from the previous video. So I'm going to click on this. And we're not quite ready to deploy. Let's also do the cat facts cron job. Let's do the same thing here under settings, click connect repo and select the same one. Now you're thinking, wait a second, we're deploying the same code. Well, actually we're not. Do remember that in our solution, we have two projects and we added two different Docker files, which are pointed to right here. So even though we're pointing to the same repository, we're actually building two different projects. Now, there are pros and cons to this. The pro is that everything's in one repository. So you could have a mono repo and you could be deploying code, pushing code in, and everything would be deploying when your code's pushed in. Now, if you have a small project, that's probably not an issue. But the moment your project grows bigger, let's say you have 20 services with 10 cron jobs. Now every little code push that comes into your repository is deploying all the services and all the cron jobs. That could be a problem. So it really depends on your situation. For this demo, it's okay to do this, but in reality, in the real world scenario, you probably want to have different repositories for different services. So maybe you have like an enterprise on GitHub and you have different repositories in that enterprise. Each repository is a different service and so on. But for this demo, this will suffice. Okay, so we've hooked up the GitHub repo and we're ready to deploy. So let's go ahead and click that. And it's going to take a little bit of time. Now, as you can see here, it's building the API and the cron job. So I'm going to fast forward a bit and we'll be back when this is deployed. All right, we're back. And you can see here that we have a failure. So this is a good opportunity to debug and see what's going on. Now you can see here that when the container was starting up, it was doing a health check at the very end. And it tried multiple times and failed. So it basically said like, hey, this replica meaning like an instance of the service, never became healthy and the health check failed. So we have a failed service. Now, this is the build log. You can go up here and select deploy logs. And in here, you'll essentially see the standard out or whatever the console write line or any kind of logging that's happening. So you can see that we're trying to instantiate something here and it's not working. So if we look at the exception, we can see cat facts API program CS line 16. So if we go to our code, we can see line 16 is looking for fact path, and that is the cat fact path, which basically means that we forgot to add a variable. So let's close that, go to variables, go to new variable, paste that in, and now the value of this is going to be /facts, and that is the same value as the mounting point for the volume, which we created earlier. So let's go ahead and add that and click on deploy. Now it's going to do a build again, which we can actually look at here. So you can see that it's deploying. If we look at the logs, now it's going to be a lot faster because the way that Docker builds is it's already got a bunch of images cached and a bunch of container layers. So it's well, theoretically, gonna be a little bit faster to build. And hopefully it will succeed. There we go. It's published and it's active. Okay, great. Now you can see here, it switched from build logs to deploy logs because you can see that we're running and there's a web server. So meanwhile, on the left, you see that the cron job is crashing, and that's because it's trying to hit this web server, but the web server wasn't up when the cron job was running. So we will remedy that in a moment. But first, we want to set up the public URL so we can actually hit this service. So if you scroll down, go to settings and scroll down a little bit to networking, you can click on generate domain. And it's asking you what port you want to listen to. Now, 8080 is the default, and we also have 8080 as the default in our application, which you can see here. So we're just going to leave that, or well, we'll type it in and click generate domain. And we're good. This is our URL that we can click on and hit. Oh, but actually, one thing before I forget, we do need to set the port variable. So if we go back to variables, add new variable, type in port 8080, click add and deploy. Now, this is imperative because we without this, we're going to be running on some randomly generated port, and we want 8080 to be the port that we're running on. So let's wait for this to build and deploy, and then we can go ahead and see our application running. So we'll swap this to 8080 and we're good. So let's wait a little bit, and when it's done, let's click and see. All right, all the deployments are done, and we see that the next cron job is going to be running in 2 minutes. Now we can click and check out the URL, and we'll see that we're getting a 404, and that's because we're hosting at facts. Now, there are no facts yet, and that is because we haven't run our cron job yet. So we're going to need to wait 2 minutes. Or what we can do is we can say run now, and it'll run immediately. So let's click on that, and it's going to initialize, build, and run. You can see it says deploying here. So if we want to click on this, we can say deploy logs, and we'll see what's happening. So starting container, calling URL, and it's done. We can also come to the API, take a look at what's happening here, and we can see that we had a request come in. The file was not found, meaning this file doesn't exist yet. So it's creating it, and then it added a fact. All right, so far so good. So can we see if it's working now? Let's go back here, refresh. Oh, and we have a fact, and that is the same fact that was added here. So there you have it. We've successfully created 3 artifacts. We have a cron job, which runs every 15 minutes. We have an API, web API, and then we have a volume connected to this API, CatFacts API service. Now, one thing that we haven't discussed yet is private networking. Now, if we go here and we look at the logs, we see it says calling URL http catfactsapi.railway.internal@8080, right? So what is this catfactsapi.railway.internal? Well, it's the same thing that if we were to go here, scroll down, and take a look at private networking. So if you have a service inside of your architecture that wants to call another service, you have to first of all, it's HTTP, not HTTPS. But second of all, it's the name of the service dot railway dot internal. That's how you communicate between services. So if we had another service over here and we wanted this API to call this new service, we would need to refer to it using its internal domain. So pretty neat. But yeah, that's about it for this video. Hope it was useful. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you guys next time. Take care.